The views and opinions expressed in the following program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of KSMQ Public Service Media Incorporated or its assigns.
Welcome to the new season of Garden Connections. I'm your host, Stephanie Passingham. We're looking forward to a great growing season, and we're going to start that right here at Bonnie Plants in Nora Springs, Iowa. Walter Ellis and his team grow 4 to 5 million plants every spring for your home garden. We'll also visit with Rick Pleggenkuhl from the Iowa State Extension Service out of Cerro County. It's always important to plan your garden before you actually start buying plants, and he's going to give us some great tips about companion planting, healthy crop rotations, and varieties that work for our area. We'll also introduce you to Jennifer McCauley-Oftelie. She's going to be helping us with our very own garden plot in the Austin Community Gardens. We'll also be hearing helpful tips from her throughout the growing season. Stay tuned for Garden Connections. It's a beautiful sunny day in early spring. Step inside one of Bonnie Plant's greenhouses and you can just feel the heat radiating through the roof. The earthy smell of plants is sweet. It's humid and warm. While many people enjoy growing their garden plants from seed, others appreciate the convenience of picking up their favorite plants that have already been started. That's where Walter Ellis and his team comes in. At their facility in Nora Springs, Iowa, Walter grows 4 to 5 million plants for delivery to nurseries and garden centers throughout the region. Walter, this is an enormous facility. Tell us, how much space do you really have here?
Somewhere in the vicinity of 400,000 square feet of growing space, and that doesn't include warehouses for storage and things like that.
And your process here is somewhat mechanized. You've got machines that fill these pots. Describe that for us a little bit.
We do everything in one location. We put all the dirt together. We mix the dirt up. We put the cups and everything, all that stuff together. We plant it in a spot. We water it, and then we load it and bring it out here.
Well, let's take a look at the process. You've got some plants here to illustrate for us what that's all about.
Sure. We've got a couple of different things here. This is actually what we receive. This is a tomato plant. This is a cherry tomato plant. Okay. This is what comes in from our growing facility down in Alabama. Okay. They start them there because this facility is not set up for germination and things like that. We've got a whole big operation where they germinate all of the plants for the entire country there at that facility.
Wow. Okay. And about how old is a plant like this when it comes to you?
This plant right here is about 17 to 21 days old when it comes to us.
So then it comes in, and what do you do with it?
Well, we step it up into this pot here. This plant right here was transplanted about 17 days ago. So this plant should be about 5 weeks old, actually. And you'll notice this plant has a good root structure.
Starting to come out the holes.
You can see them start coming out the bottom. That's a very important part of the planting process. It's not the part that you see, it's the part below the surface. That's the most important part. That's like the cardiovascular system of the plant is the roots, and that's where it gets all of its nutrients and everything like that. So the most important part of the plant is the part below.
And the little plug that we looked at is the same variety, so this is the same type of plant after just 5 weeks.
Yes, and this is the variety, the same variety, when it's ready to go to the store. This plant here is probably about 7 weeks old, 8 weeks old, maybe something like that. I'm not sure exactly, but yeah, it's about 7 to 8 weeks old.
And it already has little tomatoes on it.
Yes, it's already got little tomatoes on it, so it's ready to go.
Okay, and so these go out to garden centers, nurseries around our region, and folks can pick them up and take them home. All right, let's talk a little bit about germination. And I realize they come to you already done, but you've got a great example of how tough germination can be sometimes.
Yes. This is an oregano. This is oregano right here, Greek oregano. This is something that we grow here at our facility. But you'll notice all the little holes in here are places that we did plant seed. We plant seed in every hole but they don't all germinate. We, even with our big operation down south, we still have germination problems. And even these small ones that you can see down here, you can barely see them.
But they're coming.
They're coming, but we call that bad germination, and bad germination is just as bad as no germination at all, because that plant will most likely never be used because it will die before it gets a good root structure and grows up.
Okay. You know, home gardeners who do this at home have sometimes a similar problem. What causes poor germination? Is it water? Is it simply the seeds not good?
Well, some plants germ better than others. You know, herbs are very difficult to germ, but some even varieties of tomatoes and stuff we have germination problems with. But a combination of the water, the dirt, you have to get everything perfect to do the germination process correctly, and that's why we don't do it here. We do it all at one place because those guys are trained. You know, we've got trained horticulturists looking at these things day to day to day.
All the time. All right, great. Now you do have an example of a good germination.
Yes, this is a green bell pepper, and you can see that this is fairly full. You can open it up and see there are very few holes in here, and each cell does have one plant in it. We don't like to have 2 or 3 plants in one cell because the plant doesn't get an adequate supply, you know, of roots and nutrients and stuff like that. So.
And then these will move up to what size? Do they go to something like this, or do they jump right up to these big ones?
This is going to jump up to a cup similar to this right here. This is a strawberry plant, but it's the same kind of cup. This is what we sell most of our peppers in. It's a different color, but the same cup, and this will be planted into this, and then probably about 21 to 25 days later, it will be hauled out to the stores.
All right, great. So when folks are in their nursery center and they're looking at plants that have been started, what kind of things should they look for? Because, you know, some look better than others, and how do they know they're getting a quality start?
Well, this is a good example of something that a good deep green color. You'll notice on this tomato that it's got a good deep green. There's no damage, you know, no wind damage.
Leaves look good.
Yes,
there's no tips, burns.
And also the roots. You know, we talked about the roots. See the good root structure on that. Sometimes even these will actually grow to the flat. And so if you have a hard time pulling the flat out, the plant out of the flat, that means it's got a good strong root structure. And so it should, you know, the roots are actively growing. You'll see them growing down. You know, so good root structure and good dark colored leaves is always a good thing.
A good sign. Okay. And what about, you talked a little bit earlier when we were visiting about leaves should be upright and not drooping.
Yes.
What does it look like when they maybe haven't,
We've got
a little wind blown, or they haven't had enough water?
This is an example of a plant right here. You can see these plants on the end here. These have missed water for a couple of days, and it looks to me like you can.
Sad.
Yes, they're very sad looking. They're also, you'll notice they're wilting, but they're also, the leaves are turned under a little bit. That means they are short of light. They've had a little bit of lack of light. They could have been in the greenhouse in the shade. I don't know where they got this flat. It may have been in the warehouse somewhere. So yeah, things like that happen. But yeah, you do not want to plant that as wilted because you know it may survive, but it may not.
And it may not. In terms of the season, now you've got things that are ready to go here. I'm assuming you're shipping out about now. What's the window of opportunity? How long should folks be picking up plants to transplant outside? Should they bypass the early ones, you know, if their garden isn't quite ready?
Well,
what's the rule of thumb there?
Everybody's got a different rule. You know, everybody's got a different idea. People always want to get the first tomato. You know, a lot of the old-timey gardeners, it used to be almost like a race. Who can get the first tomato? Well, that's where a pot like this size that is bigger comes in. You see this has already got a tomato on it. A lot of people like to buy these with a container, take them home early in the season, transplant it into a bigger container, and you can move it inside and outside. Container gardening is getting to be huge in this country, you know. A lot of people with smaller areas to plant, you know, want stuff on their patio.
They don't have a big yard for a garden.
Exactly.
So, does it make a difference when plants start early and in a greenhouse situation? Are they more successful planted outside, or some of these hoop houses or low covers that people are using now in their gardens? Is that a better place to use as a transition once they come out of here? Yes,
it's always better to start the plants in a greenhouse because of the ability to manipulate the plant. If you start it outside, you know, you're at the weather, you're at the weather's mercy outside, if you understand. You know, you can't manipulate the temperature, you can't manipulate the water as much. And so in here in the greenhouse, we have a controlled environment where we're able to, you know, do whatever to the plant that we want to ensure its success. So.
All right. And this is an example. This is a really colorful one. Let's take a look at this. What's this particular
plant? Yes, this is
plant?
Purple basil. This is a beautiful.
It's basil.
This is a basil plant. We have 9 different varieties of basil. And this is our newest variety.
I've noticed that a lot of new varieties tend to be more colorful. You know, now
Yes.
they've got purple cauliflower and yellow cauliflower and purple basil. And do you find that you have to keep up with those trends in the garden world?
Yes, people, you know, the new gardeners today, they want different stuff. They go up to something and look at it and they buy it just because it looks cool. They like it, you know, they enjoy it. You know?
Right.
They don't necessarily even want to eat it. They just want it. You know, a lot of people are using these for decorations instead of flowers because a purple plant like this,
it looks nice.
right? It looks nice. It's got a good aesthetic value, and people like that. So, and it's edible.
Great.
So.
And you mentioned the strawberries too.
Yes.
I want to talk about fruit because that's something a lot of people like to try. Any helpful
Yes.
pointers on what to do with your strawberry once you get it in the garden?
Allow it plenty of room. You know, strawberries run. Allow it to have, you know, a good area to run, and you know, just watch for your weeds. Strawberries are really bad about getting weeds in them and stuff like that. But watch your weeds and allow it plenty of room.
So kind of labor intensive, perhaps.
Slightly, yes, slightly. But you'll notice that some of ours that we put out, you know, these have already got green berries on them, so they're not far from producing.
Right,
so,
right. You have such a tremendous variety of plants, vegetables, herbs, different growing rates. What's the most challenging part of running a greenhouse like this?
Oh my goodness, keeping up with everything. You know, we've got you know, all these different varieties of plants take different temperatures. We have to set temperatures different for different houses, and water rates and fertilizer rates, and even applying chemicals and things like that. It's difficult to, you know, keep up with everything. You know, what's where, and because this stuff moves out of here so fast, because it doesn't take long to get ready to go. So you put it in, and it seems like by the time it's ready, you know, you're used to it being there, and you're used to to growing it right there in that spot. It's gone, and you got something new in its place. So, you know, just keeping up with the season. It's a frantic season for us.
All right, great. Well, this is an amazing facility. Thank you so much for giving us a tour behind the scenes for gardeners at home.
Well, thanks for coming. I'm glad y'all enjoyed it.
We did. Thanks so much. Well, coming up next, you're going to meet Jennifer McCauley-Oftelie, and she is a local gardener, and she's going to be helping us in our very own plot this summer. But she also is going to be offering helpful tips throughout the season. And today, she's going to be talking about the common ingredients that you find in planting mixes for starting your seeds. Stay tuned for more Garden Connections.
Starting your own seeds at home gives you the chance to know and control the plant variety and materials being used. Let's take a look at several ingredients used in seed starting mixes and examine their purpose. Peat moss, or peat substitute such as coir, which is the fiber from the husk of a coconut. This allows for moisture with good drainage. Notice here how much moisture is soaked up by the peat moss. Now, moisture retention is essential for good germination, yet this material still maintains an open texture, allowing new roots to reach out. Perlite. Perlite is made from volcanic ash that promotes drainage as well, so your seedlings won't get waterlogged. Sand can also be used for this purpose. Lime. Lime balances the acid in your growing mix, which is the peat, and it provides a source of calcium and magnesium for plants and improves the uptake of major plant nutrients such as nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, which will be more important as your seedlings advance. Blood meal. Blood meal is usually added in small amounts as a slow-release form of nitrogen, which feeds the plants, especially if your time inside is lengthy, such as tomatoes versus lettuce. Over here we have green sand and rock phosphate. These are nice sources of micronutrients and potassium. Dried seaweed, such as kelp, can also achieve the same purpose. And finally, compost and dirt. Now, there's a debate over whether these two materials are even necessary or advisable. Now, depending on your source, compost or dirt can actually hamper your seedling's performance. You're going to want to carefully check all commercially purchased and prepared compost ingredients. Most good companies have a website which will cite testing data verifying its quality. And as for plain old dirt, I recommend just using some from your very own garden, as long as you don't select it from a spot experiencing previous trouble. Now, compost and dirt really provide the mass to a mix, or the body. And if you've been maintaining your garden soil health, will contain microbial activity that will benefit your plants. These ingredients can be found at your local nursery or garden center.
Thanks, Jen. Well, it's time to start planning our garden, and I know when those seed catalogs start coming and you start seeing displays in the store, you always are eager to get out there and pick up all kinds of seed packets and have great ambitions for your garden. But it's very important to kind of plan ahead with the space that you have available, and we've got some help with that today. We've got Rick Pleggenkuhl, who is with the Cerro Gordo County Iowa State Extension Service, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes, thanks for having me today.
All right, so we're going to talk about planning. For folks that may not already have a garden, what are some key considerations that they should be thinking about when deciding to site their garden and they're going to start from scratch? What should they be considering?
Well, probably the first thing is sun exposure. That's probably the most important thing. With most vegetable gardens, you're going to want pretty much full sun. So if you have that space in your yard, that's probably the first thing to take into consideration.
Okay, all right, so we want good sunlight.
Yeah, you sure do.
10 hours a day?
Yep, I'd say at least 10 hours for most varieties. There are a few vegetables that can take a little bit of shade, but try to put it in the most sun exposure part of your yard.
Okay, sounds good. And what about slope?
Yeah, well, slope, generally probably want to have it fairly level slope, or fairly no slope, have it a fairly level ground. If you do have a lot of slope, you can tend to have some erosion and stuff with bare soil, so it's good to have a little bit of pretty level area where you're going to be putting your garden in. The other thing you want to take into consideration is the soil where you're going to be putting your garden. That's very important. That's going to determine how well your plants do in the future years to come. So making sure that you have a really good soil, make sure it's not in a really wet spot. So if you have a place that is a little wet, make sure you kind of avoid that. So that way you don't have troubles later on with that either.
All right, sounds good. So once you have your site in place, and let's say maybe you've had a garden there before, so you already know where you're going to have it. How do you start that planning process when you look? I mean, look at some of these catalogs. The number of varieties are tremendous. How do you decide what to grow?
Well, it determines what you grow, I guess, is kind of what you want to consume is kind of the most important thing. So, and I guess the other thing is the size of your garden. If you do have a smaller garden, you're going to be kind of limited to maybe what you can use. You know, if you want to do things like squash or watermelon and you have a small garden, it's not going to be very conducive. You aren't going to get a lot out of your garden.
How can people find out this information so that they know kind of what their spacing are? If they're making a map, how do they find out how much space they need for each plant variety?
Okay, well, the biggest thing is probably to look in the catalogs that we have here or on the back of the seed packets. The seed packets have a lot of information on it. It gives you the planting depth, the spacing. This one here has the days of germination, so there's a lot of information on the back of these packets that's very useful, and it'll tell you how much you can plant, and I think a lot of the catalogs will too. And also with the extension service, there's a lot of information that's free to the public that you can download or print off, and it'll have a lot of the same information for you.
Okay, all right. And so there's a lot of pretty pictures that people can draw. I was just going to share, you know, sometimes when you think about planting your garden, you don't have to be a great artist to map it out. A simple process that I use is an Excel spreadsheet. And all I do is just take my little chart and I mark off 25 feet per cell and I jot down what I'm going to put in each one. Information about when I might want to plant it, how many plants I need for that particular space. It takes a little math. You have to crunch a few numbers. But this is really handy then when you go out into the garden and you take your clipboard with you and you know exactly what you're going to plant, when you're going to plant it, and in what space, what row, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's very important to have it planned out just so you kind of know where you're at. And then a lot of the crops too, you can do multiple crops during a season too. So it's very useful to have a map depending on what type of plantings you want to do. But it's always good to plan it out so that way you are purchasing the amount of seed that you need and then the right amount of seed for the maturity dates.
Yep.
And, so
and that's
forth.
a great point too, in that you can put radishes in very early, use those up, and then use that space again for something else that you'd like to grow.
Yeah, you sure can. Yep, you sure can. Or you can keep planting radishes in the same spot too. You know, radishes, you can have 3 or 4 different crops in the spring, and then once August hits, you can plant another 1 or 2 crops too in the fall, so or late summer.
All right, so you can plant multiple crops in the same space to best utilize your garden.
You sure can.
All right, let's talk a little bit about rotations. You hear that, they say you should rotate your plants.
That doesn't mean turn them around. What does that mean?
Well, crop rotation is very important, and especially if you have a disease pressure. What it's important is if you have, like, for example, tomatoes. Tomatoes, you can have a lot of disease problems with them, it seems, at different times. And so what it is the pathogens or the diseases, if you keep planting that same tomato in the same location and you're having problems, those diseases will be in the soil.
Stay in the soil.
Will be in the soil. So when water hits the soil, it splashes back up on the foliage, and then you'll have that same disease pressure year after year. And it can build up over the year. So basically what you want to do is you want to rotate that tomato plant to a different area of your garden at least every other year, or if you can go 3 or 4 years, it's even better to do it that way. And then that place where you had it, hopefully those diseases will be gone in that location when you go back to that area.
Okay, so disease pressure is one. What plants take out of the soil is sometimes different as well. Or you run into something like a pea, which is more of a nitrogen fixer. So there's a rotation there as well. Tell us a little bit about how that works.
Well, it's the same thing. We can see it with conventional agriculture. You see where you rotate from corn to soybeans, and same thing with your gardens. So you can use basically it's legumes, anything like peas or beans. Yeah, like you said, mentioned, they'll put nitrogen back in the soil in a crop, and a lot of the other crops will expel a lot of that nitrogen out of the soil. So yeah, rotating them will help you.
It's kind of one feeds the other.
Yeah, it sure will.
Yeah.
That's a good idea to do that if you can.
What kind of structures should we think about having in place? The plants always seem to grow so much faster than we expect them to.
Yeah, well, I guess, again, the big one is tomatoes, and it seems like a lot of people like to grow tomatoes, and the big thing is to get your cages ready. Long before the plants ever need it, so that way you aren't getting in those plants and trying to tuck them in, and you're snapping off branches or dropping fruit or things like that. So it's good to have those all ready to go and in place long before they'll actually need it. But yeah, there's like pole beans. There's a lot of different crops out there that will work good with certain structures to help them grow. And then it also goes back to if you have a smaller garden, if you can get a lot of that plant to grow up and produce fruit, you can save space on the ground. So that's another reason why it's good to have some structure.
Tomatoes is a great example. There's determinate and indeterminate, and is there a difference? Can you stake both of them? You know, these tomato cages are kind of round and fairly low.
Yeah.
Some people stake them and run them really up quite high.
Yeah, you sure can, and depending on what tomato you want, if you're going to use it for canning, if you're going to use it for fresh eating, would determine if you want indeterminate or determinate grower. One's going to produce fruit all at one time where you can can it, and the other one will produce a few fruit throughout the season if you'd like to eat it fresh.
Right, okay. Other pieces of structure, watering is going to be an issue. Smaller gardens, watering cans, spray hose should work. But when you get a little bit larger, is drip irrigation becoming more and more popular?
Yeah, I think it's becoming more and more popular. It's one of those things, and it goes back to planting your garden too. I guess that's something that can take into consideration. Make sure you have easy access to water, and so don't put it too far from your house. But yeah, drip irrigation works really well. It keeps the moisture down towards the soil. It keeps it off the foliage. And you can adjust and you can weave it in and out and get the moisture where you need it, so you aren't watering dirt, you're watering where the roots
and if you live in town, saves on your water bill.
Yeah, sure will.
All right, sounds good. You mentioned pole beans, and that reminds me that companion planting can sometimes be very helpful for your garden to help each plant succeed. Tell us a little bit about what companion planting is.
Well, companion planting is maybe intermixing plants in the same area. And there's been some research done on certain plants will do better with others, but I guess an example of one that works real well is like planting corn. If you have your sweet corn out there, and then underneath of that you can plant your pole beans, because the pole beans aren't going to really compete real heavily for the moisture and everything else with the corn, and then actually the corn will help support the pole beans as they begin to grow. And then another component to that is you can plant your squash underneath of it. If you want to do something like your squash, it'll act like a ground cover. It'll keep the weeds down, and so it kind of is, I guess, so those three intermixing is something that you can do.
Some other companion plantings that kind of anecdotally that I hear about is you should plant marigolds, for example, with other crops to deter bugs. Is that kind of gardener lore, or is there some truth to that?
Well, I think there's a little bit of truth to it. There are some of those things that certain plants have certain toxins that will keep certain insects out, and there hasn't been a lot of research, but if you look hard enough you might find it. But otherwise, use what your neighbors or your friends are using and
if it
give
works
it a try.
for them,
Yeah,
sure.
sure does.
Well, one of the things that has changed recently is when we're deciding what to plant, when to plant is often a consideration, and the zone map, the zone hardiness map has changed.
Okay, the new zone hardiness map will affect vegetable gardens a little bit, but not a lot. It may mean that you can get in your garden maybe a little bit earlier than normal, but it really has to do with horticulture plants like trees and shrubs, and having the ability to maybe planting some less hardy varieties or plants that maybe we haven't grown here, like some big leaf hydrangeas.
Because northern Iowa has moved fully into Zone 5, is that correct?
Yeah, according to the new map, Iowa has moved completely into Zone 5, except there's a few areas that haven't.
And southern Minnesota has moved kind of more solidly into that, what they call 4B.
Yes, so 4B, and actually if you look at the map close enough, there is a little portion that does dip into Zone 5 now in southern Minnesota. Yep. So basically what that takes is that's one extreme low temperature that year, below 20 below, to become a Zone 4, to give it that classification. Okay. And so that's when you look at ornamental plants, that's the big thing, is the zone hardiness can't survive that minus 20 degree or colder day.
Right.
And so I guess my recommendation to a lot of people is to maybe just try sample a few out, but I don't think I would go out there and replace your spirea and pull just yet with less hardy shrubs.
Don't switch it all over.
Yeah, don't switch it all over yet.
All right. Well, Rick, thank you so much for giving us some really solid pointers on how to plan our garden and get prepared for the upcoming season.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Appreciate it.
Yep.
All right, well, we've seen some great transplants that I'm sure you'd love to have in your garden, and I would too, and thanks to Jen for those helpful pointers on what goes into a seed starting mix. We appreciate Rick's advice here on planning your garden. We're going to have more great information for you next week on Garden Connections. I hope you'll join us. I'm your host, Stephanie Passingham.
On Garden Connections, we'd love to see photos of your garden. Or if you have questions for our garden experts, contact us by emailing garden@ksmq.org or like us on Facebook.